Welcome back to chapter 13. We are on video 5. Hopefully, we'll be finishing up the chapter with this video. So, let's begin the chapter by talking about the parathyroid glands. So, first thing is make sure that you are paying attention to your medical vocabulary. The first part of this term is para. Para means next to or near, beside. So, parathyroid glands, these are the glands that are right next to the thyroid. So, as you are studying the parathyroid, you're looking at images, you're trying to make sense of it all. Keep that in mind that the parathyroid glands are located next to the thyroid. More specifically, they're located on the posterior surface of the thyroid gland. There are four of them, and they are like four little dots, four little small balls of parathyroid glands. Basically, they are located on the tips of the wings of the thyroid. Excuse me. Parathyroid secretes one hormone, only one type of hormone does it secrete, and that is called parathyroid hormone. You will see it as PTH. You may also see it as parathormone, as opposed to the whole parathyroid hormone. So parathormone, all of those are the same thing. What parathyroid hormone does, or parathormone does, is it regulates calcium and phosphate concentrations in the blood. All right. So remember when you're talking about homeostasis, the idea of homeostasis is that we want to keep balance in the body. And the way we keep balance is we everything in the body, everything that the body wants or even doesn't want, it has to be in a particular range. It has to be in a narrow range that's acceptable by that body. And so parathyroid hormone is paying attention to, or at least the receptors um, for the hormone. They are paying attention to the levels of PTH that are, I'm sorry, the levels of calcium in the blood, the levels of phosphate in the blood, so that if those levels change and they get outside of normal range or outside of normal limits, then that will start the negative feedback reaction. Excuse me, so that then the parathyroid ends up secreting parathormone so that now your calcium and phosphate concentrations can move back up to optimal. The functions of PTH, it increases blood levels of calcium, it decreases blood levels of phosphate, increases calcium, decreases phosphate. So what it does is parathyroid hormone has an effect on the bones, the kidneys, and the intestines. All right, now let's make it make sense. Why does this one hormone act on all three of those organs? And they're completely different organs, they're in completely different locations. Well, here's why. So for the bones, the parathyroid hormone will act on bone resorption. So when we talk about resorption, we are saying that the bones already have this calcium. We want to take some of that calcium, pull it away from the bone, so then now that calcium can reabsorb into the bloodstream. All right, so PTH acts on the bones to stimulate bone resorption so that the bone material can be chipped away and pulled back into the bloodstream. Now, if you remember the bone chapter or the skeletal system chapter of the of this textbook, remember how that happens. What cells take bone and break them down, basically. Chips away at it little by little to help to remove some of that tissue. Any guess? Any guess? So the reason that happens is because of osteoclasts. So PTH will specifically have an effect on the osteoclast in the bone so that then those osteoclasts are stimulated to basically chip away at the bone so that that calcium that hardens and strengthens the bone can then be reabsorbed or resorbed back into the bloodstream. Excuse me. PTH will indirectly stimulate calcium absorption by stimulating a step in the vitamin D metabolism. So let's explain that. When we talk about calcium absorption, we're talking about absorption from the digestive system. So when you eat the foods that you eat, they should have some level of calcium in it. And the whole purpose of digestion is to break all the food down into its smallest parts, and which allows you to pull in the nutrients that you need into your body, into your bloodstream, so that your cells have access to it. So parathyroid hormone will then act on the cells. Um, Let me go back. It'll stimulate calcium absorption in the GI system by affecting vitamin D metabolism. All right. So the steps of your body producing vitamin D, um, the parathyroid hormone will take one of those steps and sort of help speed up the process so that now you have uh, more vitamin D metabolized, which will in turn affect the large intestines so that now you have more calcium being absorbed from the food that you are eating. It also acts on the kidneys. It causes the final step in the production of active vitamin D. So, the way vitamin D works is you have this inactive form of vitamin D floating around in your bloodstream once the sun hits your exposed skin. And it's important that you understand that the skin has to be exposed, meaning no clothing on the skin, no sunscreen on the skin. That's when those particular rays of the sun can then hit the skin, and the inactive vitamin D that is floating around, that vitamin D that is actually closest to the surface of the skin in the blood vessels that are closest to the surface will then be affected so that that inactive vitamin D can become one step closer to being active. All right. So that is the first step. Then that more active form of vitamin D will then float around in the bloodstream to go to other organs to continue to become its final vitamin D product. And the kidneys have that final step. All right. The kidneys have that final step. So parathyroid hormone will act on the kidney so that that final step um, to actually make that final step of producing active vitamin D to happen. All right. And that final most active vitamin D, form of vitamin D, is called calcitriol. It's also called dihydroxy cholecalciferol. Dihydroxy cholecalciferol. Remember, anytime you have these super long words in biology and anatomy and science, it's always a bunch of word parts, so make sure that you are paying attention to that. Dihydroxy cholecalciferol. So please make sure that you're noting both names for vitamin D, for the final active form of vitamin D, because you will see these again, especially if you are working with patients and you're drawing vitamin D levels. Like, you need to know which test to do, and understanding these names is going to help you. It also acts on the kidneys to conserve calcium and then to excrete phosphate in the urine. So remember also, so now we found a new job for the kidneys. The new job that we just discovered is taking the almost active forms of vitamin D and making them active. That final step in converting vitamin D to its active form. What we already knew was that the kidney filters the blood to then excrete waste out of the urine. So one of the waste products that the kidney will work on is ec- um, calcium and phosphate. Well, I guess that's not one, that's two, but calcium and phosphate. So instead of getting rid of that excess calcium, when PTH is excreted by the parathyroid, then that kidney is going to then pay more attention to the calcium that's trying to leave the body and be intentional about grabbing it and holding on to it so that um, that calcium can then stay in the body, in the bloodstream, and work in your body. It is also make sure that whatever phosphate is flowing around, we get rid of more of that. All right. So in order to keep that balance, we're getting rid of phosphate and we're keeping the calcium. So remember we said that the parathyroid hormone, para meant next to or beside. So it is next to or somewhere very close to us, closely associated with the thyroid. Well, we now know it's on the posterior aspect of the thyroid. This is the thyroid. So remember it's like the wings of a butterfly and those wings will sort of wrap around the side. So now what we're looking at is the posterior aspect of the throat. This is the pharynx, all right? And the pharynx sits posterior to the trachea, and the thyroid sits anterior to the trachea. So it's thyroid, and then posterior to that is the trachea, and then posterior to that is the pharynx. And so now you see that the thyroid, even though it starts off in front of all of these structures, it wraps around where it's toward the back. And on that posterior side, you'll see these four little nubbins. Those are the four little parathyroid hormones. I mean, sorry, parathyroid glands. In this drawing, you see the trachea here. Basically, they're showing you that it is there. It is on the anterior aspect. And yeah, that's why they're showing you that there. So, PTH and calcium absorption, you have the food, you are eating the food, you have cholesterol that comes from the food, right? Cholesterol is a type of lipid. And basically, that cholesterol becomes the backbone for vitamin D. So, just like we need cholesterol to make our steroid hormones, we also need to cholesterol to make vitamin D. And in actuality, vitamin D is considered a hormone. All right, so you have the food, you extract cholesterol from it, the enzymes in the intestines, as you're breaking down that food into its smallest parts. Some of the enzymes in the intestines will take that cholesterol and then convert it to provitamin D. That is the very first, most inactive form of vitamin D. And then you have several other steps to work on it to make it the final, most active form of vitamin D. So, provitamin D, you get the ultraviolet light from the sun that hits your skin. That ultraviolet light will then change provitamin D to vitamin D. Again, it's not the most active form, it is a more active form, and that is cholecalciferol. You can also get cholecalciferol from foods. So your foods have not only cholesterol, but some form of vitamin D. Um, Once your body makes that, This product then floats around in your bloodstream until it gets to the liver. Once it gets to the liver, that liver is going to then take the cholecalciferol and convert it to hydroxycholecalciferol. Hydroxycholecalciferol will go back into the bloodstream, float around nice and happy, paying attention to everything like a little tourist in a new city until it gets to the kidney. Once it gets to the kidneys, then it will be changed to dihydroxycholecalciferol. And that process can be stimulated by the parathyroid hormone to convert hydroxycholecalciferol to dihydroxycholecalciferol. Then now you have the dihydroxycholecalciferol that is that will have an effect on how much calcium you're absorbing into the body from the digestive system. So please do pay attention to this process, understand it, know it. Those of you who are visual, this is basically the same thing. Go ahead and look at the process. If you need any help, please come and talk to me. So disorders of the parathyroid gland, you have hyperproduction of the parathyroid, you have hypoproduction of the parathyroid. If you have too much parathyroid hormone being produced, the person that has this excess parathyroid hormone production, can experience fatigue. It can experience muscle weakness, um, painful joints, altered mental function, etc., etc. Uh, it's increasing parathyroid secretion, causes overstimulation of the osteoclasts, which can then lead to bone deformities. All right, so you have painful joints, bone weakening because of that increased function of the osteoclast. So this person can end up with osteoporosis more quickly. So, what causes this? It's basically a tumor inside of the parathyroid gland. So, they have to remove the tumor in order to remove or decrease the stimulation of the osteoclast so that hopefully your body can then rebuild that damaged bone, um, or the practitioner may have to correct it. Hypoparathyroidism, if you produce too little parathyroid hormone, remember, we're affecting blood calcium levels. So if you don't have adequate calcium in the body, that can end up with muscle cramps, and seizures. So the muscle cramps, remember, we need calcium in order to have your muscles contract and relax properly. So if you don't have adequate calcium, then the muscles won't work correctly at the sarcomere level. All right. So hypoparathyroidism can cause muscle cramps and seizures. Decreased parathyroid hormone secretion reduces osteoclast activity, and this diminishes blood calcium concentrations. So, a cause of hypoparathyroidism: inadvertent surgical removal. So, um, inadvertent, go ahead and make sure you look the word up so you know what it means for yourself. But basically, it means, oops, I didn't mean to take it out. So inadvertent surgical removal, say when they want to remove part or all of the thyroid, then they just happen to take away the parathyroid because they're attached. A treatment for hypoparathyroidism is basically you taking injections of calcium because orally taking calcium won't really work. Why? Well, because parathyroid hormone works on the intestines to absorb calcium. And if you don't have adequate parathyroid hormone, you won't be able to absorb calcium even if you take increased amounts of it orally because it gets to the large intestines and you still don't have the materials to make it work. So that is where the practitioners will then bypass the digestive system and inject the calcium directly. Treatment also will be to just give the person doses of more active forms of vitamin D, because both the vitamin D and the calcium have different functions. So, hypoparathyroidism, hyperparathyroidism. Let's talk about the adrenal glands now. So, the adrenal glands, you can also see them being referred to as suprarenal glands. Renal means kidney. All right, so AL, remember, anytime you see AL at the end of a word, that means pertaining to. Renal or ren refers to the kidneys. Add in addition to, supra, on or above. So both of these mean the place, the small organ that is sitting on and or above the kidneys, which is where the adrenals sit. So the adrenals are closely associated with the kidneys. They sit like a little beanie cap on top of each of the kidneys. There are numerous hormones that are secreted by the adrenal glands. Even though they sit on the kidneys like a little bitty hat, little cute little hat, they have a big job. So the adrenal hormones play roles in maintaining blood sodium levels, responding to stress, and it also produces sex hormones. The sex hormone production from the adrenal glands is more dependent on prior to puberty than after puberty. The sex glands will take over, so the testes and the ovaries will take over the production of those sex hormones. And then later in life, once a person reaches menopause and andropause, where the ovaries and testes are not producing as much of the sex hormones, then the adrenal gland can potentially pick that job back up. All right. So, again, one of the types of hormones that the adrenals produce is sex hormones. The adrenal glands contain two portions. You have the adrenal cortex and the adrenal medulla. Always remember that the cortex is the outer layer of an organ, and by no means is the adrenal gland the only gland that has the cortex. Then you have the adrenal medulla. Medulla, think middle. All right, so if you get those confused, try to always think middle. So the cortex is the outside or the outer layer, the medulla is the inner or the middle layer. The different hormones that are secreted by the cortex and medulla, respectively, because each of them will secrete different hormones. The cortex, which is that outer portion of the gland, will secrete your steroid hormones, which are your steroid hormones, which are aldosterone, cortisol, and sex hormones. We know that the sex hormones are your testosterone, estrogen, progesterone. Cortisol is a stress hormone, right? But it's also a steroid hormone. So it has a lipid backbone. And then you have aldosterone. The adrenal medulla, which is the central portion of the gland, will secrete non-steroid hormones. These are amine hormones. Mostly it'll secrete epinephrine. Another name for epinephrine is adrenaline. 20% of the secretion is norepinephrine. Now, focusing on the adrenal cortex has three zones or three distinct layers. Each of the layers produce different types of hormones. Now, we already talked about the the hormones that it produces. Going back to the previous slide, we have your aldosterone, cortisol, and your sex hormones. So, adrenal cortex has three zones. Each produces a different type of hormone. You have the zona glomerulosa, zona glomerulosa, zona fasciculata, zona fasciculata, and then zona reticularis, zona reticularis. All right. Now moving from superficial to deep, the zona glomerulosa is the outside or more superficial zone. This is where you are producing aldosterone and other mineralocorticoids. Mineralocorticoids, aldosterone and mineralocorticoids. The two parts of this that should stand out to you are mineral and cortical. Mineral and cortical. So, cortical, it means cortex, basically. So, minerals. It is affecting the minerals. These are the hormones that are affecting the minerals, like sodium. All right. So, zona glomerulosa is the most superficial layer producing your aldosterone and other mineralocorticoids. Get familiar with that term and what it means. The middle layer, or the layer that's just deep to the zona glomerulosa, is the zona fasciculata. Zona fasciculata. It produces your cortisol and other glucocorticoids. Gluco refers to carbohydrates or sugars. All right. So these are the hormones that will affect the sugar concentration in the blood. All right. It will help to balance, maintain a certain sugar concentration in your blood. That's the middle zone. Zona reticularis. Zona reticularis is the deepest of the three zones. This is where you start to produce your sex hormones, right? Your sex hormones. Now, it says male sex hormones called androgens. Well, the male sex hormones are called androgens, but it also produces estrogen and progesterone, which are female sex hormones. So, looking at the adrenal gland, here is the medulla, this space here, and the lighter spaces on the outside is the adrenal cortex, and it's the adrenal cortex, this outer layer, that has the three zones. So if we took this little bitty snippet and we enlarged it, this would be the outside or the exterior of the adrenal gland. So that part right there. It is surrounded by adrenal capsule. And this capsule is basically a type of tissue, a type of skin, so to speak, that protects the kidneys. All right. So you have the capsule, and then is connective tissue capsule. So it's made up of that connective tissue that protects. And then deep to that, you have the zona glomerulosa, you have the zona fasciculata, and then you have the zona reticularis. And then deep to the zona reticularis is the adrenal medulla. And this is a micrograph. So this is they actually took a piece of the adrenal cortex and looked at it under the microscope, where now you can see the capsule, zona glomerulosa, zona fasciculata, zona reticularis, and then you have the adrenal medulla. If you're interested, I won't, let me take that back. Let's talk about it. Comparative effects of epinephrine and norepinephrine. So we know that the adrenals produce epinephrine and norepinephrine. Epinephrine is also called adrenaline. Norepinephrine is also called noradrenaline. And now you can see more specifically how these two hormones are similar and in what ways they are different. They are very, very similar. So make sure that you are looking at this chart so that you can see the difference between epinephrine and norepinephrine and how both of these hormones will affect other organs, other processes in the body. Hormones of the adrenal cortex. So the three that we just talked about in a chart form for those of you who are more visual learners, you have the aldosterone, cortisol, and the androgens. So aldosterone helps to regulate concentrations of extracellular electrolytes by conserving sodium and excreting potassium. So, those minerals, those electrolytes, those things that we drink when we are sweating a lot so that we don't get muscle cramps, etc. That is what aldosterone um, affects. So those are uh, minerals that it is affected. So the factors that regulate the secretion, yeah, so sorry, plasma, potassium, and sodium concentrations. Um, and renin-angiotensin system. So the renin-angiotensin system, we'll talk about that a little bit more in depth when we get to the urinary system. But basically, this is how a way that your body regulates fluid concentrations in the bloodstream. Cortisol. Actions of cortisol, it decreases protein synthesis, increases fatty acid release, stimulates glucose synthesis from non-carbohydrates. So let's think about that for a second. We know that cortisol is a stress hormone. It is what is produced when we're trying to run away from or fight the lion, the tiger, the bear that is attacking us or our loved ones. While we are in fight or flight mode, remember that is the opposite of rest and digest, which is when our bodies are calm and relaxed and can do the things that it can do while it's calm and relaxed. Well, we're not resting when we're under stress. We're not digesting when we're under stress. If we're not digesting, then we're not pulling carbohydrates and glucose from our foods, which means we cannot get sugar from the food into our body to help our body process that sugar to make energy to help us fight the bear that is attacking us. So, since we don't have extra glucose from the foods that we're eating to help us win this battle against this tiger, our bodies will need to figure out ways to actually make glucose. You can make glucose from non-glucose or non-sugar molecules, all right, from non-carbohydrates. And this gluconeogenesis, basically making new glucose, occurs because of a rise in cortisol levels when a person is under fight or flight, when a person is under stress. All right. Adrenal androgens, these supplement sex hormones from the gonads, and it may be converted to estrogens. All right, well, I forgot that this slide was here. So let's go ahead and talk about aldosterone and the renin-angiotensin system now. But again, we will talk about it again when we're talking about the urinary system, because as you see, this occurs, the functions occur in the kidneys. So aldosterone, remember, it is a mineralocorticoid. And the minerals that we're talking about are the electrolytes. Remember, electrolytes are ions. Ions are charged particles. This is potassium. We know that potassium is a charged particle because it has this little plus on it. This is sodium. This is has a charge as well. So these are ions, and mineralocorticoids affect ions. So this aldosterone specifically promotes the excretion of potassium by the kidneys, and it promotes conservation of sodium by the kidneys. All right. You may have heard this phrase before, but where sodium goes, water goes as well. Where sodium goes, water goes as well. So if we want to get water in and out the system, in and out of an organ, in and out of the bloodstream, or in and out of the body, the way we do that, or the main way we do that, is to affect where sodium is in a given moment. So, if our body is maintaining or retaining sodium levels, then our body will also be retaining water. If we are excreting more sodium, then we are excreting more water. All right, so aldosterone promotes excretion of potassium, promotes conservation of sodium, which will then in turn retain and conserve water. The renin-angiotensin system is a system that helps the body maintain normal blood pressure. Now, why or how does that have anything to do with all of this? Well, I'm glad you asked because as we start to affect how much water is in the body by affecting things like sodium, I'm sorry, yes, sodium, we are affecting how much water is in the bloodstream. And the amount of water pressing against the walls of the blood vessels is what we are looking at when we look at blood pressure. So, how much pressure is the blood exerting against the walls of the bloodstream? Um, and that one way that that is maintained is through this renin-angiotensin system. So, angiotensin 2 is the product of this system that increases blood pressure and promotes the secretion of aldosterone. So, angiotensin 2, when it is secreted, it will promote more secretion of aldosterone by the adrenal cortex. As we increase the secretion of the production and secretion of aldosterone by the adrenal cortex, that aldosterone will then promote the conservation of sodium, which means you are going to retain more water. So that is part of the way that this renin-angiotensin system helps to maintain normal blood pressure. So again, if your blood pressure drops for whatever reason, you will produce more angiotensin 2 that will then promote more aldosterone production that will then cause the kidneys to retain sodium so that then your kidneys will retain more water, which will then in turn increase to hopefully normalize your blood pressure. Make sure you pay attention to this. This is the same thing in visual form. All right. Again, regulation of cortisol secretion. Read it. If you have any questions, let me know. Now let's talk about disorders of the adrenal cortex. Disorders of the adrenal cortex specifically. So you have the two main disorders are Addison's disease and Cushing's syndrome. Addison disease occurs when a person has insufficient hormone secretion by the adrenal cortex. So basically, this is decreased functioning of the adrenal cortex. Excuse me. When that happens, when you have insufficient hormone production from the adrenal cortex, that will result in imbalances in both your electrolytes because of those mineralocorticoids and imbalances of the glucose because of the glucocorticoids. It can cause dehydration. Remember, mineralocorticoids, specifically aldosterone, affect sodium, sodium affects water. So if you're not producing adequate aldosterone, you can become dehydrated because you're losing sodium, which means you're losing water. Your blood pressure can become low because um, because you don't have adequate aldosterone to retain the sodium and the water to help to maintain blood pressure. You're losing more water, which means you're losing more fluid in the plasma, which will decrease your blood pressure. You get fatigued, you might have nausea, and it might increase skin pigmentation. I'm not sure how to explain those, just know it. Addison's disease can actually be fatal because a person will have so little electrolytes in the body that the body then can't maintain function. So that is Addison disease. Then you have Cushing syndrome due to hypersecretion of cortisol. Usually that occurs because of a tumor in the cells that are producing cortisol. So the tumor will cause that excess production of cortisol. You may have also excess secretion of ACTH by the anterior pituitary. Remember, ACTH is the hormone in the anterior pituitary that works on that works on the adrenal cortex to control cortisol secretion. So if you have excess ACTH, that will cause an excess production of cortisol. Even though nothing is wrong with the adrenal glands themselves, these cells are being overly stimulated by ACTH because of a tumor. Usually it's a tumor in the anterior pituitary. When you have this excess cortisol production, that can result in muscle wasting. So remember that your body is in fight or flight mode, or at least it thinks it is because of this excess cortisol production. So because of that, your body's not able to maintain your muscle mass. You're not able to maintain your bone mass. Your glucose levels will be elevated. Remember, part of the job of cortisol is to make new glucose molecules out of non-carbohydrate sources. You can actually make glucose from fatty acids and amino acids. So, you have elevated blood glucose levels, so then you could potentially be looking at pre-diabetic or diabetic situation, all because of a tumor. You have more sodium retention, which means you have more water retention, which will lead to increased blood pressure. Also, because you're retaining more water, your body has to put all that excess water somewhere. All of it won't be able to stay in the bloodstream. So your body starts to pack it in your skin, in the extracellular spaces of your skin. So your skin starts to look more puffy. You also have abnormal deposition of adipose tissue in the face and back. I don't really know why that happens, but you also see that in people who are taking cortisol, like injections or orally, if a person is taking cortisol or cortisone um, for whatever conditions they are, they can get a puffy face and back. All right, there's a typical look of it. So these are the two main disorders of the adrenal cortex. Let's go ahead and stop there. I'll see you on the next video.